records it.
Yikes.
Is that okay?
Hello?
Yeah.
Sorry about that. We had a little problem connecting.
Oh no! What happened?
We lost our network connection.
Oh, interesting. Okay, good to know.
You're back.
Because you're a little blurry now as well, and I'm wondering if that has something to do with the connection or just the focus.
We'll get Will up here.
Yeah. Because I know your system might need a few updates, so I'm not sure if someone from Cisco has already reached out to you about it.
Yeah, they did a couple weeks ago.
Okay. So we'll see. That could be the issue.
I'll try reconnecting.
Well, you're pretty clear.
Okay, so we'll go with that. We'll go with that as long as we're clear. We'll get started, and then hopefully the connection sticks with us. Otherwise, we'll try and reconnect. But we'll just kind of get started. So good morning. Hello. Thank you guys all for joining us today. I have Janine Lawford here, and she's going to be talking to you guys this morning. So Janine is a social worker with a specific interest and expertise in the area of trauma. Janine has extensive experience working with individuals, couples, children, youth, and their families. She's worked for over 15 years at a local children's mental health agency, the Hank Stelcrest Center in Toronto, Canada, as a therapist, trainee, supervisor, and instructor. Janine leads both a trauma seminar and a trauma-focused assessment and treatment team. Yes, you guys are clear.
Yeah, you don't have to read it all. You can just skip it.
So, she's going to be talking to you guys this morning. I'm actually just going to pass it to you and
hello, everyone. That's nice. I have
started.
actually some faces that I can see. You're not just big blurs. So, as Jay was saying, I'm Janine. So, I also work as a consultant to the Hospital for Sick Kids, where I've been involved for over 15 years in their telemedicine program. So fairly similar to this kind of setup where I've been doing training and consulting and taking part in with a psychiatrist and doing some psychiatric consultations to rural and remote communities. So we're up in Nunavut and Northern Ontarian First Nations communities. So I understand you guys wanted to hear some discussions about fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. Is anyone willing to tell me what they really wanted to get out of today? Like what would be really important? Does anyone have like a burning question so that I can think about as I'm talking about what would be important to cover?
We did extensive FASD training probably about 12 years ago. And in the meantime, we've had a number of staff that have turned over. So the idea is so that we can begin to understand better some of the behaviors, knowing that some of the behaviors aren't willful, but rather it's being disabled by the environment in the moment. So just some strategies around that.
Okay, so does it... So an understanding that you have some basics. Whenever I'm presenting, I like to just review the basics a little bit, and I'm going to look at my screen.
Yeah, I can project it.
You don't have, I don't know if it would be better for them. Can you see me or the slides at this point? Me or the slides?
You.
Me. Okay, so we'll just leave it for a second, and then if you guys have questions. So one of the things that makes sense for me to talk about a little bit is I think whenever we're looking at FASD, so fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, the understanding is that these issues are on a spectrum. And there are different diagnoses that fall related to that. And I think the important piece for me is that this is often kind of a hidden disorder. I mean, there's in that kids with FAS, so kids with fetal alcohol syndrome, actually have features where you can notice in terms of facial features, their eyes are small, their foreheads are larger, their head circumference. So they have different physiological traits that you can say, oh yeah, that child has this disorder. However, there are just as many neurological impacts for kids who have the neurodevelopmental disorders, so alcohol-related neurodevelopmental disorders. So we call that ARND. So is everyone familiar with those terms in terms of the fact that there are kids with fetal alcohol syndrome? There are some with actual facial features, and I think when we're working with kids that have the syndrome, so they have the actual physiological features that kind of go around, and we can say, oh yes, that child has fetal alcohol. It's sometimes easier for us to keep that in mind when working with the children. The kids that are just as have just as many complex needs and often just as many difficulties are those with the neurological impacts. So the way the brain has grown, the deficits in the brain are there. The only difference is that we just can't see them visually. So often those kids are harder to spot, because if we're not thinking about them, and if they don't have the, oh, this child has some physiological features of the disorder, we kind of miss them. I think whenever I'm thinking about fetal alcohol and I'm wearing also my trauma lens, is often what happens for these kids as well is if you imagine a parent that's struggling with an addiction or struggling with alcoholism, what kind of things happen in homes when there's when there's alcohol use? Not all the time, because sometimes people don't know they're pregnant for a period of time and they're drinking, and by the time they find out it's late, and we can have those impacts. But what do you think happens if there is a home with addictions? What's more likely to happen in those kinds of homes?
Trauma.
Trauma. So what kinds of trauma come up? In your mind. So I think about neglect, right? I think about those times in university when I drank too much, and I probably wasn't self-caring too much, right? So often what we find is that in homes where there is addictions, we find neglect. We find that the children's needs aren't necessarily being met in crucial times in which their brain is developing. So we also find sometimes often increase in violence, right? When people are drinking or have problems with alcohol or drugs, lots of people's personalities change. There's less problem solving going on. There's less positive interactions. There's more sometimes yelling or more aggression or more violence, particularly in homes where there's, chronic substance use. So we have to think about often the kids that we're working with as having the neurological impacts of potentially alcohol, but then also the neurological impacts of the stress hormones that get produced in difficult, scary situations like yelling, violence, and the kinds of attachment difficulties that come along with kids that have been neglected. So whenever I'm thinking about sometimes kids in those kinds of homes, and if we have a lot of kids in those kinds of homes where there's family problems and there's history of community violence or family violence and addictions and therefore neglect, we have to think about them as not only neurologically impacted, but also social emotionally impacted. Does that make sense to everybody? So their brain is different, but also the way they use relationships could sometimes be different, because when we grow up in an environment where we have what we need, we learn to trust our caregivers. We learn to know that if Jay was my mom and I was sad, that if I cried, Jay would be there and she would come and she would do certain kinds of things that I liked. She might rub my back or get me a drink, or she would help me manage my emotions. And what happens if a parent is drinking or using alcohol is now I go to Jay to get my needs met and I'm sad, but Jay's drunk. What does she do? She might yell at me and tell me to go away. She might not just respond. I might learn that I can't necessarily go to Jay when I have a problem. I need to go to somewhere else, or I need to get it done myself, or I'm just going to cry and cry and cry until I'm so cried out that I invert into myself. So I'm going to learn different strategies. So when we have these kids with these kinds of difficulties, we have to understand that there is a neurobiological, meaning there's impacts of the actual toxin, the alcohol or the substances on the brain, but there's also attachment-related problems often when there's been neglect, because I don't trust adults to be giving and there for me and meeting my needs. So what happens in those kind of relationships is we get a very kind of scattered behavioral response in kids. So they don't necessarily know or trust that the adults in their world are going to be there for them. Does that sound familiar to any of the kids that you're working with? Yeah, some of them. Yeah, go on.
A lot of head nodding. There's a lot of head nodding.
Yeah, okay. So, what we get is we get kind of, both from a biological standpoint and also from a behavioral standpoint and a relational standpoint, is we get somebody that looks more chaotic in their presentation. Because if I'm going to get my needs and I don't have an organized way of getting them, and the way we learn to be organized and the way we manage our feelings and our behaviors is that we know that this behavior is going to have this response. What's difficult for both kids with fetal alcohol syndrome, because of the parts of the brain that are affected and because of attachment, so we have this kind of like mix, is that they don't have that consistency. They haven't had it in their relationships, and they don't have the part of the brain that's impacted. It's the part that helps them organize their emotions, that helps them have self-control over their emotions. So now we have a chaotic kind of disorganized attachment where they're doing all these different things to get their needs met, and we have a system that makes it really hard to manage and control their emotions. So it's kind of like a perfect storm mix. And so lots of the kids that I work with that have grown up in kind of these sorts of environments or with these sorts of issues, they become very confusing and very unpredictable for the caregivers. And that's really unsettling for most of us, right? Because most of us say, I'm going to get to know Jay and she's going to get to know me and we're going to work it out, right? She's going to do her thing and I'm going to understand it and I'm going to figure out what she wants and needs, and then I'll adjust myself and we'll connect, right? We'll feel okay and we'll have some sense of safety. And what happens instead is I do things and Jay responds differently. Like sometimes she responds one way and sometimes she responds another, and therefore I get confused, and therefore I try different things and I respond and I'm confused. And so therefore we have sometimes this real disconnect, which can lead to unsafety. And when we have staff or a therapist or a family, like often foster families, will tell me, like, I don't know, I feel so incapacitated with these kids. I don't know what to do, right? Like, whatever I do, it seems wrong, it seems like a not fit, and I feel really de-skilled. Does that happen to you guys? Where you feel like, everything that I know about children or doesn't seem to work, or we can't seem to make this fit. Does that feel familiar at all for you guys? Any head nod? I can't make out yes, some head nodding. Do it exaggerated or no, or okay, so some. Okay. I was like, it's hard. You guys have to give me something here. I'm just gonna see what else is here. Let's talk about toxins on the brain. So the alcohol is like a poison to the brain, and when we're born with a fairly undeveloped brain. So what happens is our brain kind of grows from this part of our brain, and it grows right up to this more complicated layer, and this is called our cortex. And in this brain development, the brain is responsible for different tasks. The original brain, the first brain to develop, is what we call emotional regulation. So it's the part of the brain that helps us control anger, our temperature, crying. So it's kind of like our primitive stress response brain, our fight-flight response brain. And then it gets kind of more complex. And the thinking brain is up here. And there are lots of difficulties with kids with fetal alcohol and with neglect and violence in this frontal cortex part of the brain. We call that the prefrontal cortex. And that part of the brain is responsible for a whole bunch of things. And that part of the brain, kids with deficits in their frontal cortex often have a wide range of difficulties. And you can get that from, inherited difficulties. You can get that on a number of levels. So it's not just kids with FAS that have trouble in that main part of their brain. So I'm going to give you a little acronym. I'm going to share it with you on the slide for a second. Is it on? No, share. There we go. Oh, thank God someone's here technology-wise. Let's see if this works.
It doesn't.
Okay, just bear with us. We're having a little bit of technology problems. So I'm going to show you in a sec. Hopefully it will work. There's an acronym that I like to think about the different impacts of FAS on kids and youth, and that's the ALARM acronym. Did you guys learn that the last time some of you trained? So ALARM helps me remember if I'm trying to think quickly about, okay, there we are, yay. If I'm trying to think quickly about the different domains or the different parts of somebody that can be affected. So adaptation. So that is really our ability to kind of adapt to new situations and to be on track developmentally with our milestones. Language, both expressive and receptive, are the next part. So that's the L in ALARM. You'll notice that they're going down. Attention and focus and executive functioning. So that prefrontal cortex part is next in the attention. Reasoning. So our ability to make sense of if A and B happen, therefore C is going to happen. So our ability to kind of make sense and use logical reasoning to sort through a problem. And memory. So when we think about kids in school, that's pretty, we can go back to me, that's pretty, like those are all domains that, in our traditional way of teaching and learning, we rely heavily on all of those domains, right? We rely heavily on telling somebody something, having them understand it, be able to feed it back to us. We rely heavily on kids being able to kind of manage a fairly complex environment, right? If you think about what kids need to manage in school, they need to remember what you've asked, understand what you've asked, reply, negotiate, deal with other kids socially. They need to do a whole bunch of tasks that become difficult with these skill deficits. So I need my slides and we're not here, so I don't know. Okay, so the next slide I have, and I'll just pull from memory, is about really keeping in mind that with some of these deficits, and I'm glad it was raised at the beginning, the idea of understanding the behavior differently. I think one of the most important things for us to remember is that all of us have what we call a developmental age and a chronological age. So I'm chronologically 44, but probably developmentally I'm more like 60. like I'm like an old woman in myself, but lots of these kids are maybe, I don't know what grades they are, let's say 10 and 11, those are my most difficult kids to work with, the 10 and 11-year-old boys. I'm like, what to do with you guys? Especially as a therapist, because they don't really want to sit in the room and talk to me. That's not their thing. So they may be 10 and 11 chronologically, which means they've lived on the earth 10 or 11 years, but developmentally, they might be a much younger child. And so whenever we think about a child, if we understand kind of what a normal trajectory for a child may be, what we see is this, right? We like to see this, and then eventually we get to 22-ish, and then we go this way, and then eventually we go back down, right? Hopefully when we're much older, in our 80s or 90s, when our memory starts to go again and we, don't perform as well. This sometimes is what happens with FAS kids, right? They don't do that normal trajectory. So they may go up, but they may go up in a very slightly different way. Because often the complex skills that we all learn, that you have had to learn to teach, to be a professional, to manage yourself in society, those are skills. And those are skills that rely on the parts of your brain. A lot of the skills that you have rely on those constructs. So those parts of your brain have allowed you to be there. So at some point you learned, even if your boss pisses you off or if your principal says something really foolish, to not flipper the bird and tip over your desk and storm out of the classroom. You learned that, because I'm pretty sure if you were still doing that, none of you would be working in the school, right? These kids haven't necessarily learned those skills. So what are those skills? I'm going to go down for a second. So one of them is managing an impulse. So this frontal part of our brain has lots of skills attached to it. One of them is called impulse control. So do you guys know what kids without impulse control look like? What do? Come on, you guys. Oh, what does that? Yes, okay, they're impulsive. Without impulse, they're impulsive. So what does impulsivity look like? Like, what do you see when you see an impulsive kid? What are they doing?
Running the halls.
They're running in the halls, yeah. What else are they doing?
They're hitting.
They're hitting. Yeah, they're like, oh, I don't like you, or they're doing stuff without thinking about what the consequences are going to be. And that's kind of classic. When we think about, I was like, wow, somebody needs some impulse control. Right. So they're pushing, they're doing things without thinking. These are the kids that will run out onto the road without thinking, oh my goodness, maybe I should stop and look to see if a car is coming. Or I have that thought, that I really like that thing, so I'm just going to take it. Like, I'm not actually going to think, like, well, taking it will get me in trouble, and getting me in trouble may be consequences, and I'm going to have to give it back anyway, and then nobody's going to trust me. Like, they're not having those kinds of thoughts, right? So before they do something. And that is the real difficulty with FAS. So whenever somebody says like, oh, traditional behavioral management stuff doesn't work, it's because they're talking about that piece of like A, reasoning, B, memory, so they have real memory related problems, so remembering things, and they're not as good at consequential thinking. So when I do something, this is going to happen, partly because of this impulsivity. They blurt things out, they don't wait their turn, they're in a game and they're like, my turn, my turn, my turn. It's trouble. They have a lot of trouble waiting and thinking before they do things. They also have trouble with emotional control. Emotional control is something that we learn though, guys. It's something that we teach. My son has a lot of difficulty with this. He's a little bit impulsive. I don't know where he gets it from. Just kidding. He's impulsive. He does things without thinking. But he also has trouble managing his feelings. He gets very big feelings. When we have a 2-year-old and they throw themselves on the ground because they can't have a popsicle, how many of us would be really upset with them? 2-year-olds. Like, I want a popsicle, and they throw themselves on the ground. What do we do with 2-year-olds? We say, I know it's hard, you can't have a popsicle, it's okay, and we pick them up and we give them love, right? The children that we're dealing with have about as much skill sometimes as that 2-year-old in the same area because they haven't learned it. And yet, when they have that same meltdown, we're like, what is wrong with you? Get up. I'm sick of this. Right? I don't know. That's my parenting style sometimes, right? So if we think about that, like, we wouldn't do that with a 2-year-old. Why? Because we understand that the 2-year-old can't help themselves on some level. We can still expect them to not have tantrums. We can still not like it. We can still help them make better decisions and teach them skills. But we don't have the emotional frustration, and we don't have the feeling like, oh, I'm doing something wrong, or there's something wrong, with my child, because we just accept that these skills aren't very good in 2 and 3 and 4-year-olds. But when they get older, we expect those skills to just naturally develop. The issue is those skills don't naturally develop in lots of kids for lots of different reasons. attachment makes it hard to have self-control and to use relationship to manage and to soothe yourselves. Trauma makes it hard because it impacts the same areas of the brain, and we don't know how to use relationship to calm ourselves. FAS, so toxins on the brain, give us problems in our executive functioning domain. Kids that have just regular old ADHD have trouble in these domains. So these are all ways in which these kids have deficits. We're not angry if a child that is born with spina bifida can't walk as well, even if they can't walk as well at 10. We make environmental accommodations. We fix our bathrooms, we give them wheelchairs, we put the light switches low, we have an SNA that helps them get from one classroom to another, and nobody does that with any issues. The problem is that you can see those problems. You can label them. You can see, oh, Jay's having trouble walking. I need to make these environmental fixes and support her to do it. The issue is that the same skills, these are deficited skills that they're coming with. We can't see them. And so we expect a child to go up in their areas, and meanwhile there's a flattening of those skills. And so we have to start thinking about these kids with potential and expecting them to change, but also accepting that there are deficits that are lifelong and chronic, and in some ways sometimes extremely profound. So we have to start to think, what are those environmental accommodations in our relationship, in our way of relating? I'm not yelling at Jay because she can't walk, that, it's about time she learned how to walk. I'm not frustrated with Jay because she can't walk. I mean, maybe I am if I'm tired and, irritable. But on the most part, I'm not expecting that, because I've understood that even if she can walk, it's going to be slow, and we're going to need a lot of stuff to make it happen. So these skills that we're talking about, thinking before you do something, managing your feelings, these are all skills that take us time. And so we have to think about how to make those skills teachable. How do we teach those skills? Because those are skills that you need to be teaching in your classroom, along with how to read, how to write, you need to be thinking about, how do I, in my creative teacher way, think about creating an environment and giving my lessons so that I'm also thinking about how I help them in these skill domains. I don't know anything about your report cards there, but ours in Ontario have the marks, but on the front page it has learning skills. Do you guys have learning skills on your report cards? Things like affect regulation, organization, cooperation. Do you guys have those things on your report cards?
Just at the lower level.
Oh, well, you guys, that's backwards, because to me, those are the most important things. I care less about how my kids are doing in terms of reading and writing and academics than I do about how ready they are to learn. How are they managing a learning environment? Because if we have those things under control, the marks often, provided they have the cognitive capacity, will come. But these are the skills that interfere with them actually learning. If I can't focus, I'm not going to learn. If I can't manage my behavior because I'm always getting kicked out, I'm not going to learn. If I'm not getting along with my peers, I'm going to have a hard time, even if I'm a genius, getting a job and holding a job. These are really important skills that we need to think about, and that is your challenge. I'm going to give you some ideas today. What time? I'm doing a time check. I'm going to give you some ideas in the next 10 minutes, but that is the challenge, to start to think about, if I was going to place this child, how old are they? And how would I deal with my own 4-year-old or my own 5-year-old or my own 6-year-old in my interactions? What expectations should I have if that's how old they are developmentally? And how do I build in my curriculum skills that are going to address and environmental changes that are going to address some of those difficulties? The other issue in executive functioning is flexibility. So these are kids that do not like change, right? They need a certain amount of routine and consistent. We need to be flexible in our brains. That is part of the frontal cortex. Our ability to say, hey, it's a supply teacher today, and oh, guess we don't have math. We have to go to an assembly, or the assembly got canceled because the guest speaker couldn't show up, and now we have to reroute our brains. We have to come in from recess and be different all of a sudden, because outside we can do whatever and inside we need to sit. So those kinds of like getting from A to B are very difficult. So we need to think about like, how do we get our kids from outside beings like to inside beings? And how do we build in those ideas that's hard for them? So do we bring them into the classroom and play music and do a mindfulness activity to kind of center them before we start working again? Do we build in time for them to go to the water, to do a stretch, to calm themselves, to focus on their breathing before we turn them to learning? How do we as teachers figure out how to get them from one physiological state into another physiological state? And how do we do it so that it's consistent and predictable and has some sense of like, this is how we do things, because this is the way these kids learn best. When things are repetitive, when they're consistent, when they can know these are the things that I do. Much like my little guy, how I got him to sleep. He had a tremendous difficulty falling asleep. I was like a crazy woman with my routine. You know, it was like bath for this many minutes, do his diaper, but massage him in a certain way, do this, sing these 3 exact songs, read this exact, so, you know, because I had to help train his brain about exactly how to get from like awake time to asleep. And that was a harder transition for him to make. So I had to build in a system so that his brain recognized what it needed to do. Working memory is a huge problem for these kids. So does anyone know what working memory is? Here's the quick and dirty about working memory. Working memory to me is like Post-it notes. So I'm going to tell you 5 things to do. Like go to your desk, pull out your agenda, write your name, put the date on it, do questions 1 through 5, and then bring me your work. Whatever it looks like. And what happens to working memory is like each one of those commands is like a Post-it note, right? In their brain. This step, this step, this step, this step, step. The point of working memory is to take a look at those Post-its, know how to manipulate them in an order that makes sense, and remember them in order to complete them. What happens for these kids is like the Post-it notes fall off, they get lost, and they're all in a jumbled pile. So now they've done the first step, and then they look into their brain to kind of be like, what am I supposed to be doing now? And it's all just a bunch of jumbled Post-it notes, some of which they may remember, but some of which they may not, and now they're not in the right order, and now the teacher's mad at me because I was supposed to be doing something and I don't remember what I was supposed to be doing, and oh my God, like, and they look like they're scattered, right? And you're like, you know, it's not that difficult of instruction. So one instruction at a time if a child has severe working memory issues. And that is one part of the brain that we know for sure is impacted in large ways by fetal alcohol and also by neglect and trauma. So often these kids have a double whammy. So whenever I have a child with really poor working memory, and this isn't their ability to remember facts about what happened, you know, it's not long-term memory. This is our memory for like steps or things in the moment and our ability to make use and manipulate those things. So math is going to be a struggle, right? Because we teach steps in math, right? Like we teach sequencing steps. We ask them to retrieve different information. They have to get the information in, they have to keep it in, and then working memory is also the part of the memory that figures out what to do with those pieces of information. So like if I was giving you a psychological test, I would say something like BFR 918 or B98RF, and then I would say the numbers first in order of, you know, larger, small to large, and then say the alphabet in alphabetical order, and you'd have to be like 9, so 1, 8, 9, B, F, R. So you have to hold those pieces and then manipulate them in their head. That's complex math, right? That's what we start to ask somebody to do. To think about how to solve a problem, the steps associated with the problem, keep the numbers in their head, manipulate them in their head, all very difficult. These are the kids that you send them upstairs, and then you find them 20 minutes later wandering around upstairs. And you're like, what are you doing? And they're like, I'm getting ready for bed. Okay. You know, like, I asked you to come up and do 3 simple things, and you're still wandering around the house, right? So it's kind of like, I need to be your frontal lobe. I need to say to you, I need you to go upstairs and put your pajamas on. And then, much like I would a very younger child, I would probably go up and say, here are your pajamas, now you need to put them on, and I might stand there and watch them. And this is very frustrating because when we think about older kids, we think, you should be able to do this. Like, I'm just giving you some simple tasks. You should be able to do this. And so we need to think about these as that's the equivalent to saying to somebody that has huge hearing problems or walking problems or some physical disability that we can notice, you should be able to do this by now. No, they shouldn't. Their brain does not work the same way as people without these issues work. Are there questions about some of these things?
Is it possible to remember one day and forget the next?
Yeah. It's possible to be better. So here's the thing about all of us. All of us have an optimal capacity and a poorer capacity, right? So my son has been sick with the flu for the last couple of days, and I've been up for the last couple of days lots at night. Like this morning, I went into the house about 4 times and kind of forgot sometimes when I went in why exactly I went in and got a bit distracted. And I was like, kind of like messy today. Like I drove around trying to find parking, and then I went on a street, and then I'm thinking, oh God, I'm still going to miss the street because it's all one ways. And I was like, you know, I wasn't like my, get my stuff organized, get here. I was kind of like, ugh. And today, it would have been harder if you give me a task to figure it out. What we know about kids with these kinds of difficulties, and particularly if they've also had neglect and trauma, is that their skills are variable. They can do it one day and not the next. And so what I hear from a lot of people is, well, that means they can do it and they're choosing not to do it. And what I say to you is, let's say you're teaching a child how to read, and one day they get to task and they read a book. But then the next day they're still needing help with the letters and, you know, and what the word is, and they seem tired and they're off and they're not reading as well as they did 2 days ago when they were spry and on, and whatever day they were having a good moment. Would you tell me that they know how to read already? If they were struggling 2 days later? No, you'd all be like, they're learning how to read. Some days they can do it, some days they have more difficulty, but we're still building in all of these supports to help them to read. It's the same thing with these skills. The difference is that most of us, when we have good executive functioning, have little dips, right? Our stuff is variable. Nobody would probably notice. I'm here talking to you. You probably wouldn't have noticed. Jay probably didn't notice that I was a bit messy this morning. My mom did, who came to look after my son, was like handing me stuff and trying to get me out the door. But like in the grand scheme of things, no, I'm not going to probably lose my job over how much I'm not functioning as well. This is what happens to these kids. Their performance is hugely variable. Also based on their emotional capacities. We know that small changes, they may have had difficulty at home in the morning, they may be more tired, that all of those things are far more impacting when you have kind of attachment or trauma or skill deficits. So what you'll see is these kids have variable performances. Sometimes they'll be doing great, and then other days you're like, whoa, what is going on? And some of that is also their emotional capacities. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Okay. Both.
So the next skill is self-monitoring, so keeping on track. That's also an issue for kids with executive functioning problems, and particularly the part of the brain that's affected by fetal alcohol. Planning and prioritizing, so having an idea about how to start a project, what steps need to get done, how to do it. They're going to need a lot more kind of instructional, okay, now you've done this, what do you think the next step is? Needs to be chunked down, small steps, doable steps, frequent monitoring, frequent check-ins. Task initiation is another difficulty. So lots of people will tell me that they find kids with executive functioning or frontal lobe deficits, whether that's ADHD, trauma, alcohol related, as lazy, because they'll know something, but they'll have a lot of trouble like actually getting to it or doing it. That's actually called task initiation. And it's actually part of us that kind of has to get up and go to kind of think about something and get it underway. So that's why kids with executive functioning have huge procrastination issues. It's really hard for them to set down and get it done. Once they've sometimes started, they're much better at it, but that initial get up and go is difficult. Organization is difficult. So often they have papers and they've forgotten their agenda, it doesn't come home, or there's, you know, a lack of an ability to, like, they're losing their hats and scarves. So they need systems. We're much better at this with our kinders, right? Like with the kids in kindergarten, they have like, hang your coat, do your thing. Like we have all of these steps. And then as they get older, we don't do as much you know, routine and filtering. So these kids benefit from that more rigid kind of like, here's your checklist, here's your visual checklist, these are the things that you need to do, then you need to get to your desk. They need much more monitoring, staying on task, helping them plan step by step how to get things done. So I'm going to go right to, there's a couple of things that I want you to remember. All of these skills, every single one of them, managing emotions, how to use relationships, social skills, self-control, impulsivity, are all learned in relationships. So the key ingredient is relationships. What happens with lots of these kids is that people stop enjoying them because they're frustrating and they're difficult. And when people stop enjoying them, they stop enjoying themselves. And if they stop enjoying themselves, then they get really off track. If they stop seeing the gleam in your eye when you look at them and when you're proud of them, and they see constant mirror of frustration, disappointment, annoyance, that's how they feel about themselves. And I think what's really important is that we keep in mind that we are the windows into their self-esteem. We develop our sense of self in relationship. We develop our sense of capacity, and we learn how to calm ourselves, how to soothe ourselves, how to manage our own frustration, our own irritability, our own sadness, our own excitement, all of which we do by relationship. There's actually a whole your brain talking to my brain thing that helps us internalize that. So when we have us not managing ourselves, and I don't know if it's worth sharing at this point. So one of the key ways of working around behavior with kids that have what we call dysregulation, so they're having trouble managing themselves, is we have to ask ourselves, how are we managing ourselves? Keeping in mind that these kind of situations where somebody's having trouble, or they're not listening, or they're difficult to figure out, or their behavior is out of control, what happens is that we start to get out of control. I consult in lots and lots of classrooms, and one of the things that I notice is that the kids that are frustrated, I was just in a school yesterday, the principal said, you know what, I'm sick of this kid, he annoys, and I'll swear, crap out of me. You know, and I was like, yeah, he can be frustrating. You know, he's totally frustrating. He's like a really difficult kid. And so that frustration is coming through in the interactions. And that's totally normal. You know, when my kids misbehave, or if my kids do something frustrating over and over and over again. You know, even though I know all of this stuff, I still lose it on them. I still yell sometimes. I'm still frustrated. I still say things like, for God's sakes, you know, stuff that I shouldn't say, that I'm not proud of. But like, we have to ask ourselves, am I embodying, am I showing this person what I want them to be feeling? So the same way we would manage a frightened infant, we wouldn't use our words. We wouldn't say to them, go do this, you need to do da, like to our babies. We would pick them up and we would say, it's okay, calm down, you need to be calm. You know, take a breath, it's all right. We would rock our babies, and it would be less important about what we were saying and more important about what we were doing. It's the same for everybody, and particularly important to keep in mind. So one of the best skills you have is to say, am I calm? How do I feel about the child right now in this situation? Am I able to manage it? Can I instill a sense of safety and calmness into this moment? Through myself. You know, one of my big tricks to get my son to fall asleep was just to actually start to breathe like I was asleep. Like I would be like, and like after a few minutes of that, I would notice that his breathing would actually follow mine, right? So this part of our brain, where we're talking right brain to right brain, is so important. It is the building blocks. It builds brains. It like does something really cool, and if I could give you more time in a whole neuroscience lesson, I would go through what was happening. But it actually builds brain material when we do that, when we look at somebody and when we're calm and when we share a moment. It builds brains, and these kids need you to build brains. So how can I reflect the state, so the internal emotional state that I want the child to have in this moment? I'll go back to the slides. So let me just go through. Okay, so this is a breakdown of the things that you guys can do, and I'm sure we can figure out how to get the slides up there to you, because there's some stuff that I didn't cover and I want to leave. I know you guys have what, like 10 more minutes maybe at the most? What time do you guys have to bolt? 5?
We have to bolt at 10 at the latest, so.
Which is what?
We got about 35 minutes max before we have to be in class.
Okay, I didn't know that. So, so let's think about another part about behavior. So, any of you have examples of kind of strange behavior that you think, like, I don't understand this behavior, like, where is this coming from, or unique behaviors? Does anyone want to give an example of a behavior that you may be struggling with in your classes?
Sometimes there are kids who might come into school and they basically
what? Sorry, you fell off.
They have gone wrong before they came to school, before they come to school.
Yeah.
It's probably just no from day one or from hour one. It's just no. It's just defiance.
Right.
No matter how you try to manage it, sometimes it's just a mental state that just stays for a little bit.
How do you make sense of that? Like, how do you make sense if a child or adolescent or anybody for that matter that's in a no state? Like, what are they communicating with you?
They're defiant because of their emotions are probably unmanageable at that moment, and that's the part that's difficult, because sometimes no matter how you try to lessen things or make things easier or soothe it away, it's just
that that's where they're at.
It's just defiance.
It sounds like, you know, you're giving some thought to kind of like, how come they came in like this morning? What's happening for them? And I think those are like really key pieces. So to assume that the no communication is a valid and real communication and is a strategy that they're adopting in that moment that's worked for them for whatever reason. So let's think about somebody that needs to be oppositional, that needs to say no, no, no. How might that be helping them in the moment? It's not helping them get on with their day at school, but how might that strategy have evolved? Like, what would one imagine the life of that strategy to be?
It's probably their own sense of power. That's probably the only strategies they have for gaining power in life. That's kind of what I think.
Yeah, maybe. So it maybe is a system of like exercising some control. We could think about it that way. Why else might we be like, no, no, no?
It's their way of coping.
Yeah, with what?
I don't know any
Like
other
that
way.
way?
Another.
Yeah. So when I think about somebody that's learned a strategy of just saying no, I often actually think about, we have to extend it. Are you doing that? Okay. Yeah. I was like, there's things flashing on the
So
screen.
you guys might have to, it'll end and then you'll just have to dial in, but I'll give you the dial-in number.
I think about, a strategy that may have evolved around almost shutting down, right? So when we think about being overwhelmed and distraught, one of my main strategies is to kind of be like, screw it. Like, I'm out, I'm done, I'm finished, right? Like if I think about like an argument or like some place that I get to emotionally where I'm just like, I can't anymore, I'm finished, I just need to be done with this situation.